Verses 24 to 27. We have reason to think that Paul had a great deal more to say in defense of the gospel he preached, and for the honor of it, and to recommend it to the good opinion of this noble audience. He had just fallen upon that which was the life of the cause, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and here he is in his element. Now he warms more than before, his mouth is opened towards them, his heart is enlarged. Lead him but to this subject, and let him have leave to go on, and he will never know when to conclude, for the power of Christ's death, and the fellowship of his sufferings, are with him inexhaustible subjects. It was 1,000 pities then that he should be interrupted, as he is here, and that, being permitted to speak for himself, v1, he should not be permitted to say all he designed. But it was a hardship often put upon him, and is a disappointment to us too, who read his discourse with so much pleasure. But there is no remedy. The court thinks it is time to proceed to give in their judgment upon his case. Festus, the Roman governor, is of opinion that the poor man is crazed, and that Bedlam is the fittest place for him. He is convinced that he is no criminal, no bad man, that should be punished, but he takes him to be a lunatic, a distracted man, that should be pitied, but at the same time should not be heeded, nor a word he says regarded, and thus he thinks he has found out an expedient to excuse himself both from condemning Paul as a prisoner and from believing him as a preacher, for, if he be not compos menti and his senses, he is not to be either condemned or credited. Now here observe what it was that Festus said of him. v24 He said with a loud voice, did not whisper it to those that sat next him, if so, it had been the more excusable, but, without consulting Agrippa, to whose judgment he had seemed to pay profound deference, ch 25:26, said aloud, that he might oblige Paul to break off his discourse, and might divert the auditors from attending to it. Paul, thou art beside thyself, thou talkest like a madman, like one with a heated brain, that knowest not what thou sayest. Yet he does not suppose that a guilty conscience had disturbed his reason, nor that his sufferings, and the rage of his enemies against him, had given any shock to it, but he puts the most candid construction that could be upon his delirium. Much learning hath made thee mad, thou hast cracked thy brains with studying. This he speaks, not so much in anger, as in scorn and contempt. He did not understand what Paul said, it was above his capacity, it was all a riddle to him, and therefore he imputes it all to a heated imagination. Si non vis intelligi, debs neglig if thou art not willing to be understood, thou oughtest to be neglected. He owns Paul to be a scholar, and a man of learning, because he could so readily refer to what Moses and the prophets wrote, books that he was a stranger to, and even this is turned to his reproach. The apostles, who were fishermen, were despised because they had no learning. Paul, who was a university man, and bred a Pharisee, is despised as having too much learning, more than did him good. Thus the enemies of Christ's ministers will always have something or other to upbraid them with. He reproaches him as a madman. The prophets of the Old Testament were thus stigmatized, to prejudice people against them by putting them into an ill name. Wherefore came this mad fellow unto thee? Said the captains of the prophet. John Baptist and Christ were represented as having a devil, as being crazed. It is probable that Paul now spoke with more life and earnestness than he did in the beginning of his discourse, and used more gestures that were expressive of his zeal, and therefore Festus put this invidious character upon him, which perhaps never a one in the company but himself thought of. It is not so harmless a suggestion as some make it to say concerning those that are zealous in religion above others that they are crazed. How Paul cleared himself from this invidious imputation, which whether he had ever lain under before is not certain, it should seem, it had been said of him by the false apostles, for he weighs, 2 Cor 5:13, if we be beside ourselves, as they say we are, it is to God, but he was never charged with this before the Roman governor, and therefore he must say something to this. He denies the charge, with due respect indeed to the governor, but with justice to himself, protesting that there was neither ground nor color for it. v25 I am not mad, most noble Festus, nor ever was, nor anything like it. The use of my reason, thanks be to God, has been all my days continued to me, and at this time I do not ramble, but speak the words of truth and soberness, and know what I say. Observe, though Festus gave Paul this base and contemptuous usage, not becoming a gentleman, much less a judge, yet Paul is so far from resenting it, and being provoked by it, that he gives him all possible respect, compliments him with his title of honor, most noble Festus, to teach us not to render railing for railing, nor one invidious character for another, but to speak civilly to those who speak slightly of us. It becomes us, upon all occasions, to speak the words of truth and soberness, and then we may despise the unjust censures of men. He appeals to Agrippa concerning what he spoke, v. 26. For the king knows of these things concerning Christ and his death and resurrection, and the prophecies of the Old Testament, which had their accomplishment therein. He therefore spoke freely before him, who knew these were no fancies, but matters of fact, knew something of them, and therefore would be willing to know more, for I am persuaded that none of these things are hidden from him, no, not that which he had related concerning his own conversion, and the commission he had received to preach the gospel. Agrippa could not but have heard of it, having been so long conversant among the Jews. This thing was not done in a corner, all the country rang of it, and any of the Jews present might have witnessed for him that they had heard it many a time from others, and therefore it was unreasonable to censure him as a distracted man for relating it, much more for speaking of the death and resurrection of Christ, which was so universally spoken of. Peter tells Cornelius and his friends, ch. 10:37, that word you know which was published throughout all Judea concerning Christ, and therefore Agrippa could not be ignorant of it, and it was a shame for Festus that he was so. Agrippa is so far from thinking him a madman that he thinks he never heard a man argue more strongly, nor talk more to the purpose. Paul applies himself closely to Agrippa's conscience. Some think Festus was displeased at Paul because he kept his eye upon Agrippa, and directed his discourse to him all along, and that therefore he gave him that interruption, v. 24. But, if that was the thing that affronted him, Paul regards it not, he will speak to those who understand him, and whom he is likely to fasten something upon, and therefore still addresses Agrippa, and, because he had mentioned Moses and the prophets as confirming the gospel he preached, he refers Agrippa to them, v. 27. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? Dost thou receive the scriptures of the Old Testament as a divine revelation, and admit them as foretelling good things to come? He does not stay for an answer, but, in compliment to Agrippa, takes it for granted, I know that thou believest, for everyone knew that Agrippa professed the Jews' religion, as his fathers had done, and therefore both knew the writings of the prophets and gave credit to them. Note, it is good dealing with those who have acquaintance with the scriptures and believe them, for such one has some hold of.